There's a moment that tends to arrive quietly, not as breakdown and not as a crisis, more of a kind of realization that's difficult to ignore once it's there. On the surface, things are working. You're still performing at a high level, still making decisions and still holding responsibilities in ways most people wouldn't fully appreciate unless they've been in it themselves. But internally, something doesn't quite feel as flexible as it used to. There's a sense that the way you operate has become more fixed than it once was. It's become less optional and more automatic. And I think it's important to be very precise here, because this isn't about losing capability. It's not about diminishing performance. In many cases, you're still operating at a very high level, but the experience of it has changed. And that's the part that tends to get overlooked by most people, because identity doesn't feel like something you chose in real time. It feels like something you just are. But if you look closely at identity, it's actually something that forms through repetition, through reinforcement, through what has worked and what has been rewarded in the past, and also what has kept things stable. And over time, those patterns stop feeling like strategies and start feeling like personality. Just let that land for a moment, because that shift is subtle but very important. What began as a way of operating under pressure slowly becomes the default version of you. So you don't just use control, you become the person who controls. You don't just use discipline, you become the disciplined one. You don't just use responsibility, you become the responsible one. And on the surface, that looks like strength. And in many ways it is. But there is a quieter consequence that comes with it. Because once a strategy becomes identity, it stops feeling optional. You don't step in or out of it anymore. You stay inside it, even when it's not required. Even when situations don't need that level of structure or containment anymore. And that's usually where people start to notice something that feels slightly constrained, not externally, but internally. A kind of inability to fully relax out of the way of being that once made complete sense. Now, the key point here is this. The identity that helped you build stability is often the same identity that limits your experience of it, because it was formed in a context where control, anticipation, responsibility, they were all necessary, where staying ahead of things mattered, where not dropping anything mattered, where being reliable wasn't just useful, it was essential. But that context doesn't fully exist in the same way anymore. And yet the system hasn't updated its definition of what's required. So it confuses behaving as if it still needs to maintain that same level of structure, even when life has already moved beyond that point. Now, this is where things become quite interesting, because identity feels very stable from the inside. It feels like continuity, consistency, like this is just who I am. But from a system perspective, it's actually a collection of reinforced responses held together by repetition and familiarity. And what holds it in place isn't truth. It's repetition under similar conditions. So when conditions change, but the responses don't, you start to experience a mismatch between who you are being and what the situation actually requires. And that mismatch is often felt before it's understood. You might notice it as a kind of unnecessary effort, or tension in situations that should feel simple, or a difficulty stepping out of a certain mode even when it would be appropriate to do so. And the instinct is usually to try and adjust behaviour, to become more flexible, more relaxed, less structured. But that rarely reaches the root of it, because you're not dealing with behaviour at that point, you're dealing with identity level organisation. And identity doesn't shift through instruction, it shifts through updated experiences. Now, there's something really important to say here. This isn't about becoming less driven or less capable. It's not about dismantling what's worked for you. It's about recognizing where that way of being is still running without being consciously required anymore. Because the paradox is quite clear. The same identity that created success externally can restrict how much of that success you actually feel internally. Not because anything is missing, but because the system is still operating as if something needs to be held together. And over time, that creates a very particular experience of life, where things look fine, they function well, but don't always feel fully open. There's a kind of subtle compensation to experience, a sense that things are slightly managed rather than lived. And this is often the point where people start to question what's actually going on, not in a dramatic way, but in a recognition that something isn't fully aligned anymore. Now, the important shift here is not to reject the old identity, it's to understand it, because what you're looking at isn't a flaw, it's an adaptation, a very intelligent one, but an adaptation that hasn't fully updated itself to the current environment. And when that happens, it keeps running as if the original conditions still apply, even when they don't. Now, in the next video, I want to go deeper into something slightly more confronting, which is how identity doesn't just limit freedom, but can also start to shape how safe it feels to even step out of it. Because that's where things really start to lock in, not in behaviour, but in perceived safety. If you want a more detailed breakdown of how this identity forms underneath pressure, and how to start shifting it at the level where it actually changes how you experience life, click the link underneath this video. That is where I go deeper into this and explain how to work with the system directly rather than just trying to adjust behaviour on the surface.